was interested in getting, first of all, long-time fan. I've been an admirer of yours for a long time, Lord Monckton, and I was interested in perhaps getting a few of your thoughts on, of course, the global warming agenda here. There's lots of content of yours on the internet. People can look up your seminars and so on. In fact, I watched an hour and a half seminar that you put on yesterday. What do you think is the real agenda behind this? Do you think it's a global money grab? It just seems to me like all they're interested in is the money.
Well, of course, the reasons why anybody does anything unprincipled are usually to do with money, power, and glory. And what has been happening really ever since socialism first began to emerge and then turn into its rather poisonous communist and national socialist forms is that the idea of democracy, which your founding fathers wanted you to have, is proving increasingly unpopular with the entire governing class. And you can see this in a number of different areas. I mean, global warming, of course, is the real aim here of those who are driving this at the UN, has been from the start to establish the global government that they've largely already put in place in secret, and which is going to have the seal set on it by the Paris Climate Agreement. And that's coming up just in December. And I've just been reading the sort of May draft of that treaty, which is the most recent one available. They haven't made the June draft after the Bonn conference available yet. And it hasn't changed much, I think, from May to June. But the key point here is they're going to establish what they used to call, quite openly, a government. And then I publicized that in 2009 and said, look, this is what they're up to. The word government is actually in the treaty draft. This is what they're trying to do. And this caused enormous panic all around the place. And 3 million people saw the video, and there was a huge fuss. And everybody in Congress was briefed by their voters about it. And the Chinese eventually blew the whole thing out of the water at Copenhagen, so that didn't happen. But the world government wannabes are still at it. And at Cancun, the following year, to 2010, they actually put in place 1,000 new supranational bureaucracies, or global bureaucracies, so many of them were, as the sinews of this new global government, regardless of the fact this had all been thrown out in Copenhagen. They just carried on. And in Paris, they're now no longer going to call it a government. They're coyly going to call it a governing body. And this governing body is going to be given, if anything, even more powers of taxation, regulation, and direct intervention in the affairs of the member states of the UN, which is very nearly every country on earth, than even the proposed previous government that failed at Copenhagen would have had. And reading the treaty draft, which none of this has appeared anywhere in any mainstream news medium, it's very, very clear that this is a grab for absolute power, absolute wealth, and absolute glory on the part of quite a small clique in the bureaucratic and governing class who have become tired of democracy, assuming that some of them ever loved it in the first place, and are now determined to rule by decree globally. And I'm afraid this may all sound ridiculously extreme until you actually read the treaty drafts, both of 2009, where they were quite open about trying to set up a government, and now where, as I say, they're coyly calling it a governing body, but it's very clear that the powers of that governing body will in all but name be the powers of a global, unelected, dictatorial government, of which the member states of the UN will become simply satrapies on the model of the old Persian Empire. And this is a very disturbing development for those of us who like the idea that government of the people, by the people, and for the people should not perish from the earth, because if that treaty gets through in Paris, and I'm afraid at the moment I think it's going to, then that will be, in effect, the end of democracy worldwide, to the same degree at least as democracy has already gone in Europe as a result of a similar démarche on the part of the governing class in Europe in setting up the European Union, and then gradually over the years transferring more and more absolute power and, of course, wealth to itself. leaving less and less room for democracy in the individual member states, so much so that 5 laws in every 6 that are now passed in our parliaments are in fact passed because the European dictatorship has ordered that they should be passed. And there is a European elected parliament, at least, but that has no power. It cannot even bring forward a bill. And in the treaty draft for the Paris Treaty on this climate nonsense, then they're not even making any provision for any of the relevant officials to be elected, for there to be any elected parliament, even as a talking shop. Nothing. This is going to be a sort of bureaucratic centralist dictatorship, very much on the National Socialist or Communist model, to give absolute power to the favoured few who manage to climb up the greasy pole and become part of it. And
can I jump in for 1 second?
Yeah, by all means.
I saw an article, and I mentioned it to Mike, and I don't know. I mean, I want to see if I even understood it, but I told him that you and I, when you were here, you gave a speech at the Heartland Institute in Chicago, was it?
Yeah.
And I had seen where the Heartland Institute had tried to attempt, or they've had meetings or wanted another meeting with the Pope, and basically my understanding, what I was reading, that like their information was not even entered, in the Pope's mind, and basically they've kind of pushed away any information from the Heartland Institute. The fact that there is no opposing view, it's almost like the Pope has made his mind up, it's settled, and it's done.
That's exactly the point. And what the international left have tried to do, and I use the term left loosely, I mean, they're essentially fascist. It's a corporatist fascist structure that they're proposing. And the people who are pushing this are the corporatist fascists, like, for instance, the so-called Democrats in the United States, who are no longer Democrats at all. And they, in order to get away with this global government, they've had to have an excuse. So they had a practice run with the Montreal Protocol to see if they could fool nations into taking a decision which the science didn't, if one was honest, actually justify. And they got away with it with great ease, because they discovered that the vast majority of the governing class worldwide is scientifically illiterate. And if you dangle in front of it the idea that they are here at a historic juncture when it has been discovered that we are in some way ruining the atmosphere, and therefore they are the people who will lead us out into the promised land and away from this potential disaster, they love this kind of stuff. And then that was the trial run, and in fact Bert Bolin of the IPCC, who originally set up all this nonsense, both the Montreal Protocol and then eventually the global warming, once the Montreal Protocol went through, he said to Professor Richard Lindzen of MIT, who was a climate skeptic and the most eminent atmospheric physicist in the world, he said, just wait till you see what we do with global warming. And that was way back in the mid-1980s. That they were already laying plans for this. And then by 1992, when the protocol gone through, this remark was made to Lindzen, who was told the global warming is going to be a real big push. And it was quite clear to him then, and he's written a scientific paper about it, that they were aiming to establish a global dictatorship by panicking the world's environmental movement, which is largely totalitarian, is largely fascist itself, into buying into this rubbish, and then into making sure that they're near absolute control of the global news media, because there's very, very few independent news media left. They're nearly all under the thumb of this essentially fascist movement. That they would never report any facts, however obviously true, however obviously relevant, and however obviously interesting, if those facts in any way departed from the party line that was being peddled for the sake of eventually setting up this global government. And that's why, for instance, you will have seen practically nowhere any report that the world hasn't in fact warmed for 18 years and 6 months now, completely zero trend. There's been no statistically significant warming in the entire 25 years in which the UN's climate panel has been doing its stuff. Now, facts like this, I could give you dozens of others, all of them are plainly interesting and relevant. They plainly establish that huge exaggerations have been made by these wretched climate models. These facts do not make it into the mainstream media.
They've got the Pope convinced. That's the part that's here.
Well, they haven't got the Pope. The Pope really is a communist anyway. He starts out from the totalitarian perspective. He comes from liberation theology. Liberation theology began when Latin American Catholic students went to universities in France in particular, like the Sorbonne, and they picked up communism there and took it back in the form of what they called liberation theology, which was effectively a thing saying capitalism is a bad thing. And that is really the Pope's main message. He hates capitalism because he comes from this communist tradition. And so he has been told that the only people who are saying there isn't a problem with the climate are paid by wicked fossil fuel companies to say it. Doesn't realize there are people like me who are publishing research. Almost monthly now I get a major paper in one of the leading scientific journals on this, saying the complete opposite. Nobody pays me anything to do this. And the Pope hasn't been told, again, he hasn't been told the other side by anybody. One of his commission of 9 cardinals that advises him is, in fact, Cardinal Pell of Sydney, who I know quite well and who is a very strong and very well-informed climate skeptic. But I think the main reason why Pell was brought to Rome was to shut him up so that he couldn't go on saying global warming isn't a problem. And so the Holy See we were there when I went to Rome with the Heartland group in the end of April, and we got into the Vatican, and we got into the meeting at which they were planning all this, because we got ourselves accredited as journalists to the Holy See. I explained to the Heartland Institute that was the only way we'd ever get in. They were not going to let us in however much we might contribute to the scientific literature. They didn't care about our side. So I said we can get in as journalists and at least report what they're up to, which in fact turned out to be very useful. Because one thing we did learn was that not a single person there that they had consulted was on the skeptical side of the case. They had deliberately excluded anyone who wasn't going to talk about the party line.
That's the part
and
that
so, yes,
me.
this was...
The fact that they were not even open, nor did they talk, nor did they even discuss that it was, even the possibility of any skepticism. And
exactly.
It was just settled science, and that was it. And they weren't even open to listening for the rest of the facts.
No, their minds were entirely closed. And this is one of the most disturbing things about this. And we saw it, I must say, with the establishment of the European Union, where only one side of the facts tended to make it into the newspapers. There were a few people like me who, at that time I was writing for the national press, who were able to put the other side in, so at least there was some exposure. On the global warming thing, virtually everywhere worldwide, you virtually never hear any of the really key data which established that these predictions were just extravagantly absurd. And there's a lot of people who genuinely, because of the one-sidedness of the media, the total control that this fascist organization has over the media, they simply don't realize there is another side to the story. I think the Pope, who starts out on the fascist side of things anyway, simply has never really heard that there's a serious factual argument against it. Now, what I did when I saw the leaked draft of the encyclical, which came out a day or two before the main document, I wrote very rapidly to Cardinal Muller, who's the prefect of the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, whose job is to stop the Pope from saying silly things. And I just said to him, look, whatever line he wants to take on the theology of all this is, of course, his business rather than mine. But if the scientific section of this encyclical is going to be as reported, you need to know, and you need to tell him that on every single one of the 8 scientific points he made, these points are inaccurate as a matter of demonstrable and unarguable fact. And I sent him the references to all the facts, and I gave him the names of the various scientists he could talk to who were experts on each of these areas of fact. Now, I didn't expect or get a reply, but the Holy See has recently been making noises that the Pope hadn't, after all, intended to try to say there was only one side on the science. Well, of course, he had tried to say that. They've now realized that was wrong, and they're backing off. But, of course, the publicity has been obtained by putting it out the way he did, and this is an old trick the left use. They know they're saying what isn't true, so then they kind of half withdraw it a week or two later, but by that time the press publicity has been massive, and the publicity for the kind of half-hearted withdrawals they make is never anything like as much. This is the games they play. And so how one now deals with it is it's very difficult to see. I mean, I'm continuing to publish scientific research. I had an enormous paper in the Science Bulletin of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which is their learned journal, equivalent of the Royal Society's journal over here, or the National Academy of Sciences journal in the States. This is the big one in China. And this was a major paper showing where the computer modelers had got it wrong, and putting forward a really simple computer model that you can actually run on a pocket calculator powered by solar cells if you want. You can be really green, and instead of consuming the electricity of an entire large town, which these computers do when they're doing the big models, and you can actually get more accurate results from our simple model than you can from these huge machines. And this provoked such fascination that this paper has been downloaded by scientists all over the world, 10 times more than the previous most downloaded paper in the 60-year archive of this distinguished journal. So very slowly among the scientific community, the truth is beginning to spread. We didn't even try to submit this paper to any English-speaking journal because they've all been completely captured by the communists. The curious thing is that in communist China, they are still doing something recognizably like climate science. And we were able to put forward a case. It was savaged when we first submitted it. The reviewers were furious. They said, but you are questioning the findings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and you can't do that. And we wrote back and said, we're terribly sorry, but we have given scientific reasons why we're questioning it. If you can't find anything wrong with those scientific reasons, then you must allow us to question it. That's how science is done. This is not a religion. And they then let the paper through, and it was published. And then, of course, the left were furious, and they tried to publish a rebuttal, which went in last month, I think, or the month before. And we've literally heard yesterday that our response to that rebuttal, which is another major paper, which demonstrates that our model actually works best if you kind of hindcast past temperature change over the past 250 years, over various timescales and under various assumptions. Our model will come far, far closer to predicting what actually happened than these big models do. It's actually working better than they are. We didn't know this because we constructed it simply originally from first scientific principles and then made predictions from it. But then, the other side said, but you haven't checked whether it worked. It would have worked if you'd applied it in the past. And it does. It works better than theirs do. So, we are gradually making sure that the scientific community can't get away with altogether ignoring that there is another side to this case, and increasingly that this other side of the case, which is the skeptical side, is the right side of the case. It is true, objectively speaking. I mean, you can't go on saying you're ever more convinced that your huge models are correct in their vast exaggerations, when with each month that passes without any increase in global temperature, the divergence between what they predicted and what has happened grows ever wider. And this is the curious feature of the debate at the moment. They're saying they're more and more certain than ever that their predictions are correct, when their predictions to date are wider and wider and wider apart from what's actually happened. Huge exaggeration. To give you just one figure, if you go back to 1990, when the UN's climate panel made its own first forecast, it said that by now there should have been an amount of global warming which is just over 2.5 times greater than what's actually happened. Now that is an extraordinary predictive failure. And yet the wider that divergence becomes between what they predicted and what's actually happened, the more they say they think the science is settled and certain and we're all doomed unless we shut down the West. And of course that's the aim in all this. China, by Obama, has been exempted from doing anything at all to cut its emissions of carbon dioxide. Now, China, the Chinese leadership has had a private briefing from me on this. I went to Shenzhen 2 years ago and gave them quite detailed briefings, both on the science and on the economics. Likewise, 3 years before that, which is why this briefing happened, I had given a talk at the World Federation of Scientists in which I'd explained, based on a rather obscure consideration, which is the change in the Earth's albedo as a result of a withdrawal of the normal amount of natural cloud cover over the Earth between 1983 and 2001, for reasons which appear to have been natural, because it's all swung back the other way, back to normal again. But it was that caused at least half of the warming that happened from 1983 to 2001, which was the thick end of the warming of the 20th century happened then. And that, of course, has now reversed itself. So the Chinese ambassador to Italy was sitting in this meeting together with his scientific counselor. This was about 2011. And they came bounding up and they afterwards, and the scientific counselor said, "I want your paper. This goes to Peking in the bag tonight. You know, they need to know this. We had no idea that there was any other side to this story." So now the Chinese know, because that's why we put our paper recently in the Chinese Academy of Sciences bulletin, because that's read by everybody in China. It's caused this enormous sensation. 30,000 people have downloaded it or something, which for a scientific paper is just extraordinary. And so we are gradually managing to assert the case. And the fascinating thing is that when we came to do the paper upholding our original paper, and we sent that in, instead of going through 3 rounds of difficult peer review, it went through 1 round of difficult peer review, because you could see the reviewers didn't like the fact that our model, simple though it is, actually produces better results than these huge machines. But in the end, when we made the revisions they requested, and we sent it back, and we said, actually, we've now done still further tests of this model, in every single one of them. The quite narrow interval of temperatures we predict, the real world temperature actually falls on that interval. We're getting it right every time. And they took one look at that, and they said, well, this must be published. This is actually significant. And so gradually, in the scientific side of things, via China, we're able to fight back. We couldn't do this in any Western journal. They would simply refuse to publish. But in China, as I say, they're still doing science. Right. And this then, because I know various newspaper editors, when the next paper comes out, I'll do what I did with the last one. I'll get massive national publicity for it in the UK. That'll be picked up by all the left-wing newspapers trying to spit and sneer and snarl at it. Right. And they'll go around interviewing all sorts of lefty scientists who will try to say it's all rubbish. But they know now that they're dealing with people who know the science, and they won't get very far if they try that. And if they do that, all they do is to serve to publicize our paper still further. And in this new paper, we've also got away with putting in things they kept on taking out from the earlier paper, but they've now realized that we're right about it. We've actually got a graph showing the changes from month to month in global temperature over the last 18 years and 6 months, since December 1996. And we've shown that the least squares trend, which is the way of working out whether it's warming or cooling or staying much the same, with all the temperatures jiggling up and down either side of the trend line, we've shown the trend line is flat, 0, for all that time. There hasn't been any global warming for that length of time at all. And now they're printing that. And this will be the first time any scientific journal has actually printed a graph showing for just how long there hasn't been any global warming. That's how biased this thing has been. But now they're going to. And that's going to go all around China and all around the world, and people are suddenly going to say to themselves, my God, this is a peer-reviewed result. They've calculated this trend, they've put it in a peer-reviewed paper, no global warming for 18 years, 6 months. Wow. And that is something they can no longer deny. And that's not what they predicted. So much for the science. Of course, one then moves on to the economics. And here, they're in a real mess, because one of the consequences of the increasing compartmentalization of the sciences, where most climate scientists don't know that much climate science, but they know absolutely no economics, and most economists know no climate science at all, trying to do a proper intergenerational or intertemporal investment appraisal to decide whether you should spend money now on trying to make actually non-existent warming go away, or whether you should wait, see whether it happens, and then even if it does happen, you simply pay the cost of adapting to it the day after tomorrow rather than trying to stop it happening today. That question has not so far been correctly addressed in the economic literature because, as I say, the two disciplines concerned, climatology and economics, don't know enough about each other. And so the economists don't know how to apply the standard equations to determine climate sensitivity, which are used by the UN's climate plan land and all these stupid models, to the techniques of investment appraisal so as to reach an intelligent answer. Instead, what they do is they use a cop-out in the form of a thing called an integrated assessment model, which in fact is just a collection of random numbers and fudge factors. It doesn't actually do the job properly at all. And so I have been getting papers into the economic literature. I had one published by the World Federation of Scientists in 2013, which does this correctly. And people who read it simply can't believe how staggeringly cost ineffective it is to try to do anything about global warming, even if it's going to happen at the rate they say, which it isn't. And even if the cost of it happening at the rate they said, if it were to happen, would be as great as they said it would be, which it wouldn't. But even if you assume both those things, it would still be between 10 and 100 times more expensive to stop global warming happening today than it would be to let it happen and pay the later and far, far lesser cost of simply adapting to its consequences day after tomorrow. So that is the other side of this, the economic side, which hasn't been properly done before. And I'm the first person to have done it properly. And that also is very slowly beginning to make its way through. I gave a briefing to staffers in Congress about this about 18 months ago, in which I actually took an example in the case of the Australian carbon tax as it then was. I said, this is why when Tony Abbott gets his feet under the table, he's going to abolish it. And I went through the figures for that, and I showed that that was around, I think, 25 times more expensive to make global warming go away with equivalents of the Australian carbon tax all around the world than it was to let it happen. And they were mesmerized. They were fascinated by this. They said, and you're doing this analysis, aren't you, on the basis that the panic is correct, scientifically speaking? I said, yes, that's how I do the sums. I mean, I don't believe the panic is correct, scientifically speaking, but even if you assume it is, it still isn't worth spending a single red cent stopping the warming from happening. If we were to be stopping cooling from happening, that's an important thing to do, because cooler is a much, much bigger way of killing people than warmer is. If the world gets warmer, it doesn't actually make that much difference to anything. But if it gets cooler, even just 3 degrees cooler, you can start an ice age. If it gets 3 degrees hotter, it doesn't actually make that much difference, economically speaking. And although I was one of the first to point that out, even the UN's climate panel has now accepted that that in fact is the case. There isn't much economic cost to letting global warming happen. So slowly, the truth is dawning on these people. But at the moment, they're so desperate to get their world government in place that they will not admit any of this. They will not admit that they have begun, the more honest ones, to see that this is the case. But very interestingly, for instance, 3 years ago, I had a debate with Professor Ray Bates, who is one of the world's top 6 experts on what are called temperature feedbacks. And in the UN's climate panel's understanding, in most of the models, they're not ours, they assume that these temperature feedbacks amplify the warming from CO2 twice and 3 times over, and that's why you get a problem. The direct warming from CO2 is tiny. It's 1 Celsius at most. If you double the CO2 in the atmosphere, and even that, only half of it comes through straight away, and the other half takes hundreds of years. So you don't actually have to worry too much about that. But what they are saying is that this doubling of CO2, they say, well, we think it's going to cause 2 or 3 Celsius warming because of these feedbacks. So I had this debate with Bates, and I showed him the equation which they use to do what is called the mutual amplification of these amplifying feedbacks. And I said, if you use this equation, on the assumption that there are these very strong amplifying feedbacks, then the equation stops working. It doesn't work. You get silly results. And that's why you're getting these very high estimates of how much warming we're likely to get. It isn't actually going to happen. And I said the equation, in fact, cannot apply to a system like the climate with very high feedbacks. It can apply with very low feedbacks, but not with high ones, because the climate is essentially thermostatic. It's like the Earth has a thermostat, much as the same as the one in your house. You set it to have a particular coolness or a particular warmth, and it will allow variations, typically 3 degrees Celsius or 5 Fahrenheit, either side of that before it switches itself on or off, because otherwise it would be switching itself on and off every few seconds. And the Earth has a thermostat the same, which varies by about 3 degrees Celsius either side of the long-run average over the whole of the last 810,000 years. How do we know? Because by taking the ratios of two particular isotopes of oxygen in air trapped in the Antarctic ice in layers which are laid down year by year, we can go back 800,000 years and see what the temperature was at the time that ice got trapped. And that gives you a reconstructed temperature history, which is kind of a bit average, but it gives you some idea of what the temperature changes were, and they weren't very great. And that was enough to give you ice ages at one moment and a nice, pleasant climate like today at another, but not enough to imagine that there are these huge feedbacks operating. So I explained all this in my talk, and Bates sat there, and when I showed him the graph of this equation of white work for the climate, he went white. And he said to me afterwards, he said, I've been wondering about that equation. He said, it's clearly central to their case of very, very high sensitivity. And he said, until now I had believed they were broadly right. He said, but now that I've seen the graph of the whole equation, I'd never seen that before, he said, I'm going to have to do some more thinking about this. And he sent me his paper of 5 years previously, 2007, I think it was, in which he had said this particular equation has to be used with great caution. And he said, I'm now going to do some thinking. And just 3 months ago, he got in touch. And he said, I have published a paper saying that you're right, damn it. He said, the amount of warming we can expect for a doubling of CO2 concentration is indeed less than 1 Celsius degree, because I've been saying it's less than 1. He said he reckons it's around 0.4. He said it's just not a problem. And he said that is a very surprising outcome from that debate, because he'd gone in there, to argue the official position. But he's an honest man. There are still a few of them around. And he's also a man of very great eminence. He's one of the top 6 experts on this feedback problem. And so he is having great difficulty, of course, getting his paper published. He unwisely submitted it to a Western journal rather than the Chinese one. And they turned it down flat because it came to the wrong conclusion. They didn't even review it. They didn't even produce a proper reasoned argument as to why it shouldn't be published. And this from one of the most eminent professors of climate science around. They just weren't going to give him the time of day because his conclusion was fatal to the entire project. So he is going to Moscow to give a talk on this, I think, sometime next month, which is where it will first come out. And he won't send me his whole paper yet because, of course, it's still under review theoretically. He's appealed against their rejection and is trying to get them to look at it again. I don't think he'll get very far, to be honest. I mean, there's just too much at stake for these people to admit that they're wrong, because he is the guy who knows. And if he says, look, actually feedbacks don't work this way, Monckton was right, in the end, they're going to have to listen, or they're going to have to show him where he's wrong. And it's much harder for them to tell him he's wrong than it is for them to tell me I'm wrong, because he's got a bit of paper saying he's a professor of science, and I don't. But he saw the point all right. And so, as I say, in the scientific community, gradually they are being driven back and driven back and driven back all the time, to the point where the campaigners on this issue will no longer debate with us. We invited them to the Heartland Conference this year, as we always do. There was a Heartland Conference 2 weeks ago in Washington. I spoke at it 3 times, and including the final sort of rah-rah speech at the end. And the other side would not come to debate with us because they know that wherever they debate with us, they will lose. And so in their heart of hearts, they know that they're not telling the truth on this. otherwise they would debate it with us. They know they're not telling the truth, but it is so profitable not to tell the truth. It's so politically expedient. It's so socially convenient and above all so financially profitable that they're simply not letting go. And they're driven as well by political correctness, by this thing that once the Communist Party line on a thing like this has been established, then if you're in academia and you take a different line, they will punish you. They will take your tenure away. They get rid of you.
I couldn't believe one day I heard on MSNBC, Mika Brzezinski, she actually said there is no profit in telling the truth. And I couldn't believe, nobody caught it or whatever, but she made like a comment. I'm thinking, there is no profit in telling the truth. I mean, if that's not a statement, I don't know what is.
Well, I mean, that, of course, is exactly how they now behave. The very idea of objective truth, of truth that is true whether you or I or anyone believe it to be true, is something which the left and the totalitarians in general have always opposed, and now oppose with great viciousness. And there's an entirely new trend which is known as modernism. It was excoriated by, I think, Pius IX was the first who had a go at it a century ago, as being the ultimate heresy, because it denied the very possibility that anything could be objectively true, including the teachings of religion. It just said there's no such thing as truth. And that is the line that the left now take. It's all about the political expediency and the party line. The party line now takes the place of objective truth. This is a very dangerous development when it penetrates, as it now very largely has, into the sciences. So that no longer are you dealing with what is the real truth of this question. You're simply dealing with, well, the party line says this, and therefore all science that's published on this must at least reflect the party line and preferably actively support it.
Bill Clinton's statement, it depends on what the definition of is, and then I like Reagan's line, it's not that our liberal friends are ignorant, but so much of what they know just isn't true. What he really wanted to say was that they're a pack of liars, and if they told the truth, I'm just saying, you'd be on to them. I mean, Reagan, politely, I mean, if you interpret Reagan's statement, what do you think Reagan was really trying to say? If you really
well, of course, he is saying they're not telling the truth. He's not actually pronouncing in that particular moment on whether they know they're not telling the truth. But, of course, they do know they're not telling the truth, a lot of them. I mean, there are plenty of, don't get me wrong, there are plenty of useful idiots, as Lenin used to call them. The vast majority of the left don't bother ever to inquire into the truth because they know that for the sake of their careers and their income, all they need to know is the party line. And once they know what the party line is, if they spout that faithfully, they'll do fine. And but there are the few on the left who are driving these things. They know perfectly well what the truth is. They know that global warming is not a problem, is not going to be a problem. It's simply made up and exaggerated beyond all reason. But they will never admit that because they are gaining huge political advantage by pretending that what is not so is so.